The Confessional is brought to you by LOCKEROOM, the groundbreaking fan engagement platform turning your physical touchpoints into digital access points. With a simple scan of QR codes or tap on NFC-enabled merchandise, your once anonymous followers become active members with verified fan IDs across your whole ecosystem. Connect fans globally through matchday rituals, vibrant communities, exclusive content and experiences, rewards, digital memories, and much more. Own the relationship, own the data, compound fan value, and unlock direct revenue streams from your biggest supporters. Find out more at www.lockeroom.app. And now, on with the show.
I'm Roger Mitchell, and this is The Confessional. Today we've got one of the most interesting people in our sector of sport. I'd say our industry is actually quite lucky to have the person joining me today. Who better to be in a confessional than an Oxford-educated theologian by the name of Charles Harry Finlayson Methven. Eton-educated, then Oxford, as I said, then started his career in the sporting life, Fleet Street, Telegraph, elite PR advisor, then became a football CEO and investor, still is to this day, and now also a market-leading podcaster. Charlie Methven, welcome to The Confessional.
Thank you, Roger. And I look forward to what the coming time has ahead for us. As an Anglican, I'm not as used to confessionals as you might be, but I nonetheless look forward to the privilege.
Well, you're just a hairbreadth away from us, really. I mean, like, it's a small step, and you're right there back home, as they say.
Yeah, we could do an entire podcast just on that topic, but we shan't.
Well, we may touch on it because it is obviously very interesting for me, because I always believe that people are the product of their education and what they've decided to study. And I'm always fascinated by people that have done things like the humanities and history, theology, obviously. Very, very good. So anyway, let's kick off, because I don't know where this is going to go, but I'm certain we're going to have a great time today on this. I'm certain about this. I'm certain. For what and to whom do you need to ask forgiveness?
So I want to sort of kick off, Roger, by saying that as I've gone on in life, I've become increasingly sort of net negative on a lot of self-reflection. And I think that's probably because in the last 20 to 30 years, our society has gone very, very long on self-reflection and perhaps a little bit short on doing and achieving and actually holding yourself to account in terms of what happens tomorrow rather than yesterday. So in some ways, my nervousness about appearing on The Confessional is not so much to do with what people might think of me, but more to do with I've decided I turned 50 recently, and I decided almost as a sort of gift to myself on my 50th birthday to look forwards rather than backwards. So this is like a parting moment to look back over the first 50 years of my life. In terms of who I need to ask forgiveness from, the list is pretty long, but I tend to think that for an awful lot of those people, they were people who had the voluntary choice of whether they associated themselves with me or came into my orbit in some way, shape or form. So to a degree, at least, they only had themselves to blame. But when it came to my elder children, that wasn't the case. I got my daughter, who is now 20, and my son, who is 19. I was divorced from their mother when they were 5 and 4, respectively, and for sure have tried my best, as most do, to be a good and dutiful dad. But effectively, that sort of coincided, or not long off coincided, with me entering into the sports industry on a full-time basis. And I listened to your interview recently with Giles Morgan, who reflected on his time in Hong Kong and what that meant for his for the children from his first marriage, and so on and so forth. And actually, as Giles was speaking, I reflected, not for the first time, but nonetheless reflected seriously on how patient my elder kids had to be as I trudged from one football club to another. Not least, they had to keep on changing their allegiance. I brought them up to be Oxford United fans. Then they had to become Sunderland fans, then Charlton Athletic fans. In the interim, I took them to Tottenham Hotspur when I was working there. And it's required them to be, I think, quite flexible in terms of, hey, I'd love to see you this weekend. I'm going to send you train tickets and I want you to come up to Sunderland and we're going to have a great time. Now, of course, it was then on me to make sure they did have a good time. Otherwise, at some point, they get old enough to decide that they don't want to spend time with their dad. But nonetheless, I think that they were, in retrospect, remarkably forgiving of their dad's indulgent sort of, career, rather than just being like a lot of their friends' dads, somebody who worked in financial services, had an office in London, came out on the weekends, did his dad thing, went back to the office. I was more erratic. Sometimes I would say, hey, I've got 2 weeks free, let's go off on holiday. Another time I would say, look, for the next month, if you want to come and see me, you're going to have to come and see me in Sunderland. So in many ways, it required them to be more flexible than kids of that age would normally need to be. And for that, I owe them a lot of gratitude. And in return, I guess, if they do feel any residual resentment at how mobile I made their childhoods become, then I ask for their forgiveness in that regard. That's
a great answer. I'm going to segue on that because Sunderland is a big part of who you are now. And Sunderland Till I Die must have aired exactly in that moment in your children's lives where they're very concerned about their own cred, their own vibe, their own brand. And it must have been very difficult for them to have their father so high profile. How did they feel about you and how you came across on that documentary?
I think in some ways for their generation, which views things a little bit differently from our generation, Rog, is that I think to a degree at least, it was more like my dad's a Netflix celebrity. And that conferred its own particular kind of credibility on their age group. I guess we're talking now about 8 years ago. So they were sort of 12, 11, this kind of thing. Maybe it was 7 years ago. Anyhow, they weren't yet at that stage of their lives where you're mixing amongst people who are taking deep and nuanced views about, reputational issues, how somebody came across in this way or that way. It was more like, oh my God, like my dad's on Netflix. And that was just at the time when Netflix became a big thing, and particularly for that generation. So at least from the way in which they tell it, there wasn't a lot of downside. At the same time, I'm sure that there have been times in their lives when somebody's said to them, I saw your dad on that show and I thought he was a prick. And that must have been difficult for them. It's something which I never had to encounter because my father was an absolutely sort of, decent, sensible, upright guy who no one would ever say an ill thing of. Whereas the reality is when you run football clubs or indeed football leagues, as you know, this is not something that's given to you. People will take very strong views on whether what you're doing is right or wrong. And the vast majority of people taking that view will be utterly ignorant of the wider context of the situation. They are in the same position that I'm in when I go and watch a film. Do I like this film? Do I not like this film? Now, do I understand the broader context of the production budget? Do I understand the audience which it's really targeting? Do I understand anything about the future economics of that particular film production? No, I'm just a punter. And I just turn up and say, yeah, I thought he was shit in this, or I thought he was great in this, or whatever it might be. So I think in a way, it was almost fortunate that they were pretty young. They were pretty young and pretty sort of, oh yeah, my friend said he saw you on Netflix the other day, etc. I think probably the more challenging thing came later on when they were older and I went to Charlton. And went to Charlton as an already fairly well-known figure in the world. And by this point, 3 years ago, they were in their late teens and were much more able of reading up on stuff and so on and so forth, both positive and negative, and much more aware, perhaps, of the broader ecosystem than they had been at Sunderland 5 years previously.
As you said, 7 or 8 years ago, which in our world is an eternity. Sport is week by week, weekend by weekend. 7 and 8 years is an eternity. Looking back now, are you happy with the way you portrayed yourself in that documentary with having 8 years experience now?
Again, I think this goes into what I said earlier on about too much self-reflection can be a rather unproductive thing. it came with ups and downs. Did it portray me accurately? Kind of like more or less, rather like a cartoon version of me. And I think that's kind of what these series seek to do.
Of course.
You know, if you remember, the original documentary series about Sunderland was actually, well, in fact, the original football documentary series was about Sunderland in the late 1990s. It was called Premier Passions. And the star figure was Peter Reid, effing and blinding, and real old school figure, gaffer, you know, came across pretty crass at times, frankly. The Peter Reid that I then got to know subsequently was a very thoughtful, measured, high IQ, high EQ person. But that wasn't how the makers of Premier Passions portrayed him. They portrayed him as an old school football dinosaur. And of course, there's elements of that which is true. Does Peter Reid swear when he speaks? Yes. Does he have a pretty direct way of speaking? Yes. So there are elements of it which is true, but there was large chunks of it which were chopped out of his personality, because what they effectively want to do is present you in a certain particular way, which is easy to digest. And in my case, as a Southern educated person coming to try and turn around a Northern football club, that was a very particular kind of caricature that I was never really going to be able to get away from without totally betraying everything about who I am.
Right. Okay. So message understood about let's not look back too much. We could have talked about that more. I think you came across well there. I think history will be and has been very kind to you in Sunderland, and much more so than the person that you took over from, my old mate Martin Bain. So let's move forward. Here's right up to date. We're still on question 1, Charlie. You're a confident guy. You've got a strong way of communicating with a lot of gravitas, confidence all the way through it. And the other thing is, you don't sugarcoat things an awful lot. Here's my question to you. Do you feel you need to ask forgiveness to anybody if you've told the truth to them, but they are of a character that they have been in some way hurt by the truth?
I'm absolutely fine with so doing. And there have definitely been many along the way who have worked for me or who have been on the other sides of deals from me who have felt bruised and experienced. There have been many, indeed, who I felt bruised by. But I certainly wouldn't require forgiveness to be given to me by anybody who have been on the other side of the equation. I view it as part of life's rich tapestry. And I view it as part of a learning experience and as an understanding that if there's certain things that you don't like, don't put yourself in positions where you expose yourself to those particular types of activity or behavior or whatever it might be. Now, when I started my working life, I was a Fleet Street journalist. And the managerial techniques on Fleet Street were rudimentary, to say the least. It was the era of Paul Dacre's Mail, of Kelvin Mackenzie's Sun, of Piers Morgan's News of the World. It was of typewriters or subsequently word processors being thrown at people's head, of people being punched in the face and being told in no uncertain terms on a constant basis about their individual and sexual shortcomings. And that was my school of learning. And there were people, young people, who were on the papers with me in that era who couldn't take it. It hurt them so much to have what they saw as these unpleasant people speaking to them in that way, that they would rather remove themselves to a provincial newspaper or a local radio station than expose themselves to that kind of intensity. And these are things that you would have been very well aware of in the music industry of the same era.
Yeah.
All the creative industries were the same. And in fact, frankly, the financial industry was exactly the same as well.
Yes, it was.
So I'm afraid my view largely is if you can't stand the heat, get out the kitchen. And if you decide that you are going to take yourself out the kitchen, then I might very well say as you leave, look, I'm really sorry that it seems to have hurt you in this way. But it doesn't remove my intention to try to intensely pursue the goals which I believe the organization that I'm involved in should be pursuing at that time. And that my role in that is to try to help drive that improvement and drive that change. And I want alongside me people who I would regard as being fighters in the trenches rather than people who are looking for psychological support on a regular basis.
Yes.
And so I'm not particularly interested in asking for or giving forgiveness when it comes to work relationships. You choose to be where you choose to be. If you want to be a social worker, go and be a social worker. If you want to come and work in the intense world of professional sport or national newspapers, be aware that every detail matters. It has intense implications for tens, hundreds of thousands and millions of people. And it is incumbent on us to care deeply about those details and to try and get them right. And that probably doesn't mean having endless HR conversations, which take weeks and months, etc. I care a lot about working conditions. I was the trade union leader at the Telegraph. And for 4 years, I think I was. And I cared very deeply about how our pensions were being treated. I cared very deeply about how shift workers were being remunerated. I cared very deeply about how long it took to pay expenses. I care about what I think is fair play. I really care about that intensely. But does it translate through into a gentle style of discourse? I'm afraid you've known me well enough and long enough now, Roger, to know that's not my thing. And if people want that from me, they're looking for the wrong guy.
That's a very, very fulsome answer on the micro, on the operational, on the executive side. What I'm maybe alluding to now is that now you've become a very, very popular macro commentator on sport. We'll come on to the podcast later and we can have a wider chat on that. But I'm asking this, when you speak the way you do about other industries, other sports, not people that are working for you directly, whether that's women's football, whether that's Ben Stokes, whether it's about the horse racing world, you've got a very firm opinion that I have to say 9 out of 10, I think you are absolutely right. But it's an honest opinion, and I'm sure in 2026 there are a lot of people that get quite bruised about that. Do you ever feel you need to pull punches in case there's somebody that is triggered by whatever opinion you have?
Yeah, I think on an individual basis, I think it's always worth considering the impact of your words. I remember when I was in hospital with cancer, and a Sunderland fan managed to find the hospital I was in and called the hospital to make sure they wished that I knew that they hoped I would die.
Oh, Jesus.
That was a difficult thing to handle at that time in the middle of chemotherapy. So I'm not unaware of the personal impact of very personally delivered slights. Okay, it would be inhuman not to be aware of that, not to understand the individual criticisms which are deliberately targeted at a person, particularly one which is not in a position to answer you back, right? Either that's because they're a bit further down the food chain, or actually sometimes because they're a bit further up the food chain and therefore not in a position to make a statement. I think you always have to be a little bit aware of those things and say, this is my opinion, this is what I'm here to do. But at the same time, I have to accept that this is not necessarily the correct opinion. But when it comes to what I would call institutional criticism, when it comes to bodies and entities and positions within those entities, and when it comes to what I would call constructive criticism, I think they've got it wrong, not through ill intention. I think they've got it wrong. I think that they could get it better or whatever it might be. Or sometimes I thought that they had got it wrong, but actually, as it turns out, I was wrong and they were right. I think you need to have that counterbalance. Otherwise, you can end up as a sort of talk sport style shock jock, sort of shouty person who just is constantly trying to shout over the edges. I don't think that's helpful either. So I guess, look, have there been times in my 30-year career when I look back and think, I could have been kinder there?
That's my question.
Of course. Absolutely, of course. And particularly in my time as an employer, were there times when, even under the pressure that we were under, because I've taken time out to put an arm around somebody and say, look, I don't want to put this in a nasty way, but I think perhaps we could do this in a slightly different way. Absolutely, yes. But as I said, in reference to the earlier point I made, is in a societal sort of way, I think we are in danger of prioritizing the latter in favor of the former, and saying that fundamentally the performance doesn't matter, results don't matter, but what really matters is how people feel. And I don't think that's a useful way to view the professional world. That's not my belief system. As I said, I could have become a vicar. I chose not to be. Many of my friends did become vicars. Once I decided to try to make my way in the media world and then the marketing world and the sports world, my aim is to try to deliver value, because there are people out there who are paying you, and they deserve to have value delivered back to them. And if you're going to compromise that value to try and become a social worker, I don't think that's a helpful compromise to make.
Look, you brought it up there, so I'm going to ask you about the theology thing, the vicar thing. Why did you study that at Oxford? What was the reason? Were you a religious person?
A really boring answer to an interesting question, which is, when I was at Eton, I was a fairly middling performer academically. And this is in my first 3 years. As you know, in your early years at school, you do all the subjects. And Eton ranked you every year from 260 to first. And back in the days, even before me, they used to sit you in the theatre and say 260th so-and-so, 259th
Unthinkable
so-and-so.
Today. Unthinkable.
They call it counting up. And I was like a relatively comfortable, like 130th out of 260. I was just pedaling along the middle. But what that missed was that I was very poor at science, of which you had 3 science subjects. I was pretty average at mathematics, but I was pretty decent at art subjects, and I was exceptional at one subject. And in that subject, I came first at GCSE. And the subsequent of that was really that Eton grabbed me and said, "Oh, we didn't really know that you were good at something. We just saw you as a middling guy, but actually it turns out that at one thing, you're really, really good at this. So now you should really consider taking this further." And the result of that was that I was then given some, and this is the real privilege of the Eton education, right? I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about, there is no privilege to being shoved in some shitty boarding house at the age of 13 with a bunch of people beating the crap out of you. There's no privilege in that. There's no privilege in eating terrible food when all of your contemporaries are back home eating good food. There's no privilege in that. There's no privilege in having sometimes some unsatisfactory staff around the place taking an interest in you in ways which they shouldn't do. There's no privilege in that. The privilege comes in the teaching and the ability sometimes for exceptional teachers to get hold of you and to say, right, I'm now going to inspire you. And that is not exclusive to Eton, and it's not exclusive to private schooling, but it probably happens a little bit more often at Eton and in top ends of private schooling than it does in the state education system. So where the privilege comes is that once they decide we really want to educate this person, then they can turn that tap on and give you exceptional education at that point. And at that point, I was given utterly exceptional education in theology, which meant that when it came to the entrance exam for Oxford and the interview system for Oxford, that I'd had by that point a year to a year and a half of exceptional, inspirational teaching by 2 teachers who were themselves exceptional men. One of them, who was the conduct, that's the head chaplain at Eton. He's the highest paid churchman in the Church of England. It's an official state position, the conduct of Eton. And he'd been the Archbishop of Canterbury's personal chaplain, his speechwriter effectively. Previously, a man called John Witheridge, who went on to become headmaster of Charterhouse, exceptional theologian, effectively had been the personal theologian to the Archbishop of Canterbury. And then a guy called Mark Jones, who we named Jesus Jones, who had been a don at Cambridge, but had had quite a lot of children, and at some point decided I need to look after my family. So I then moved from being a don at Cambridge to being a teacher at Eton. So I had these 2 utterly exceptional theologians, world-class theologians, who I then had the benefit of for 15 months, who not only taught me, but inspired me in my subject, and meant that by the time I applied to Oxford, I was desperate to learn more and understand more about this fascinating subject. But it came originally from a pretty utilitarian place.
So you go to Oxford with all of that beautifully explained, and Oxford being Oxford, I'm sure you're even more inspired What's going through your head at this point? You said you want to be a vicar. That means dedicating yourself to something that is these days quite left field. How did you come to a decision that wasn't for you and you were going to do something else?
It was never going to be for me. That was never the reason I read theology in the first place. And probably of the 40 people on my course in my year, only about 7 or 8 were heading in that direction. There was a separate course which was for people who were strictly reading theology just for the priesthood. It was a 2-year course rather than a 3-year course. And normally it was a postgraduate course for people who had studied a different degree somewhere else. So there were 7 or 8 of us who were probably going to go on and train vocationally for the priesthood. But to be honest with you, like a large chunk of the rest of my degree course was just on shitloads of drugs. It wasn't, it was a very like...
I get that, Charlie. I get that. I just find it incredibly interesting. You mentioned these 2 people who inspired you. What do you think, we're maybe still on question 1, what do you think they felt when they saw you working for the newspaper of the Turf Accountant after everything they'd said to you over these years?
I don't know with reference to those particular guys, because I don't think that they ever educated me with the purpose of me entering the priesthood.
No, I get that.
I think that they were very specifically interested with me pursuing the academic subject of theology as far as I could. When it ended up with me working in newspapers, which I was only a racing journalist quite briefly, so I was on the Telegraph not that long after leaving Oxford. Within a year and a half, I was at the Telegraph. I think the sort of general view was, okay, well, he's in a writing career.
Telegraph would have ticked a box. It would have ticked a box.
That sort of ticks that kind of box rather than going into the city or something like that. And yeah, there were lots of academic type people at the Telegraph. It was sort of almost quite contiguous in some ways.
Of course.
Certainly the Spectator very much was. So yeah, I used to sort of keep in correspondence with some of my Eton masters, and they were sort of I won't over-examine it, they seemed sort of broadly happy that I'd ended up writing without necessarily thinking that I was writing particularly interesting stuff. They might have rather that I was writing some more profound things than I was actually writing, because I ended up, after not too long, becoming the gossip columnist. But, I think, again, these people were not pompous people at all. They were happy that somebody who was of upper to middling academic ability, not a star, they'd managed to get me into Oxford. And that was something which I think, and in fact I know, because they told me subsequently they regarded as being a satisfactory thing for them.
Oh, of course, terms of their, massive satisfaction for them.
In terms of their satisfaction. There's one thing, like there are a lot of guys at Eton who are exceptional academically. From my generation, Kwasi Kwarteng was the top King's Scholar and was always going to go on and get a first at Oxbridge, etc. And there were many others similarly. But for someone like me, who was a little bit more middle of the pack, to end up doing well enough academically to go to Oxford, get a good degree from Oxford,
that's
and
a huge
so on
win
and so
for
forth,
everybody.
I think that gave them a degree of satisfaction.
Oh, huge win for everybody. That's the way it should be, as you said. Right, listen, question 2. What's the deal you wish you hadn't done?
Oh, my God. There have been a lot. Something totally outside my normal career, which tells you everything you need to know, which is not long after selling my shares in Sunderland, I decided to buy a pub hotel.
Ah, I did not know that.
And this was during COVID.
Fuck.
And it was on a bet, which was really based, I guess, more on my own personality, that after everyone had been locked up for a year, that they would come back and actually want to go out again and want to enjoy themselves and all this type of stuff. But of course, the truth was exactly the opposite, which is everyone was locked up for a year and decided that actually they really liked being locked up and given free money to sit on a sofa. So it turned out that it was actually the worst possible time to invest in the hospitality industry. And that was, if I was to go back and have my time again, there's no way I would have made that deal. No chance. It was an absolute dud of a deal.
Okay, well, like you say, nothing that comes to mind in our industries of sport now. I tried to think what you were going to say, and I couldn't come up with anything. For people that don't know, and if there's any Sunderland fans out there, where are you sitting now? Where are you sitting now? And where were you when Charlie came in? Foundations were built.
I think that's a difficult thing. I think that's a really difficult thing for some Sunderland fans to answer, because the truth is that broadly speaking, for a year and a half, 2 years, I was very popular with Sunderland fans. But then there was a leaked recording of me in a private meeting saying, casting aspersions over some Sunderland fans' understanding of finance. And that really totally changed the perception of me, totally fairly, by the way. I said that. And I'm a great believer. You know, I just said earlier on, I don't really want to ask forgiveness or be forgiven. Like, you got to bear the stuff that you say. And even if you say it when you're frustrated, even if you say it, you know, in a way that you wish subsequently you hadn't done, the bottom line is you said it. And, you know, it's just the way it goes. So,
but it wasn't a lie. It wasn't wrong. What you said was correct.
No, it's actually the definition of a gaffe, right? Which is, I always remember Alan Clark in his diaries defining a gaffe as an uncomfortable truth.
Lovely. I love that. Never heard that before. I love that.
Yeah. And that was a true gaffe, which is, it was and is true.
Of course it's true.
But it's the truth that doesn't need to be expressed or said, and there's no benefit to anybody in it being said. And that queered the relationship and the pitch, which then meant subsequently that when the club became successful, there was then a desperate attempt to try and say that it had nothing to do with me, right? Which I understand, I get it. I'm not, like, as I said, I'm not going to go back and try and relitigate the past. As you say, we went in there and it was 180 million pounds in debt. It was losing 30 million pounds a year. And 8 years later, they're in the European, they're in the Europa League, and they're break even, and they've got no debt, and the whole thing's flying. So if you watch the ball and say, this is where they were before, this is where they are now, and there was somebody who was there for 4 years in between, then it's quite hard to say that I screwed up that club. But at the same time, I'm not like stupid enough to expect that a whole bunch of people are going to turn up to me and say, given that they've heard what I said about some of them, they're going to go and say, thanks a lot, you did a great job. Now, some of them do, by the way.
Sure,
right?
sure.
In fact, just on the train just now, I was down here and coming down here from the centre of town, and there was a Sunderland fan on the train who said, look, I know you get a lot of shit, but my God, thank God you came in when you did. Otherwise, we could have got out of business. But that is, you know, a relatively rare occurrence. For the most part, they'd rather believe that I had nothing to do with it, and that basically everything good happened in 2 years. There was a massive turnaround, and they went from being from here to being in European football. Don't pass go, don't collect £200. The whole thing happened overnight. And as I said, to be honest with you, you can't tell people how to feel, right? It's a sort of mug's game to say,
it's a mug's game.
This is how you feel. You feel angry, you feel upset. You shouldn't feel that way. But the thing about feelings is that they're feelings. And they're not necessarily rooted in rationality and in facts and numbers and all this type of stuff.
Definitely not.
It's rooted sometimes in the stories that you tell yourself to keep yourself, happy at night. You have to accept that and understand it, that this football club means so much because they've lost so much, that therefore this is a slightly different thing from a normal football club, right? This really, really represents the identity of this community.
Of what's left,
and that is true, as you know, Roger, of Celtic.
Yeah.
Your club.
Yeah.
And it's true, as I know from my Argentine roots, of Boca Juniors. And it's true of maybe like Red Star Belgrade, I can think of. I can think of 4 or 5 other clubs.
Loads. Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say loads. I'd say that there is a relatively small...
something like Feyenoord.
Feyenoord.
Yeah.
Feyenoord, which is, a club very close to Sunderland's heart. I would say that there's a group of very large clubs where it means a little bit more than it does to the fans of other clubs. And I don't say that in a derogatory way to the other clubs. I've worked at Arsenal, I've worked at Spurs, but I can say, as somebody with Glaswegian roots on the one hand and some of Argentine roots on the other hand, as someone who's worked at Sunderland, that there are certain clubs which mean a little bit more than just being a football club. And Sunderland's definitely one of those clubs.
Well said.
And I'm very respectful of that. And that's why I say that I'm still privileged to have worked there. I'm privileged to have been involved with that club. I'm privileged to have had some amazing times there. Both the two godfathers to my 6-year-old daughter are from Sunderland, are Sunderland fans. We met when we were living up there. Met some absolutely phenomenal people there. But of course, yes, it does also come with this ugly side as well.
Let's go back to the two things that I've tried to link here with this question. Truths and not sugarcoating them. Truths that you called a gaffe is an uncomfortable truth. I made the mistake, this isn't about me, but this is the context for the question. I made the mistake for thinking that you could explain stuff to football fans. You could explain rationally whether it's... Right, okay, you know where I'm going with this. Are we ever going to get to a position on anything, whether it's about why it was complete insanity to give Mo Salah another contract, give Mo his dough, whether it's that, whether it's explaining promotion and relegation and what the cost of that really is, whether it's about the inevitable Super League, is it on all of us as thought leaders in this industry to try and intellectualise that for the fans, or is that a lost cause out the gate?
It's a great question, and it relates to what I said earlier on. People's feelings are their feelings, and football is partially about emotion. And if we get into the sport and we want to try to make a business out of that, we shouldn't then be able to wish that away and say, well, we like the emotions when it works for us, and then we don't like the emotions when it doesn't work for us. I think that's a big mistake. I think it really depends on the context, and it depends on the group, on the fan group. So obviously I went from Sunderland, and we've explained before the nature of that club, which, as I said, I've equated with Celtic and Boca and these types of places. And then I went to Charlton, which is a radically different club. That is a bottom-up club founded by a group of street kids where the fans, and even now, and even when they're in the Premier League, they volunteer to do everything. It's a volunteer club. It's a club. It's not an institution. It's a club, actual club. They don't feel entitled to anything. They think everything has to come from them. When they lost the Valley, they rebuilt it themselves on their own. Okay, Celtic and Sunderland would never do that. Never in a million years. They'd always expect somebody else to do it for them. At Charlton, they do it themselves. Now, this is a fan group who work mostly in financial services or in other areas of Southeast London business, I'll put it mildly, which tend to be very commercial. So every conversation you have with a Charlton fan will be highly rational, highly commercial. So, in other words, you can intellectualize football as much as you want with Charlton fans because they want you to do that. They want you to explain it to them. They want to understand the football market like they understand the bond market, which is their market, or the insurance market.
That's an outlier in our sector.
It is an outlier. It is a total outlier. Oxford United was probably somewhere in between. When I was at Oxford, obviously it's my home club, so I understand the ecosystem super well. And it's a bit of a mixture of the two. You've got some quite middle-class fans there who do want to understand, but you also got the car factory workers for whom it's more of a feeling and more of a passion. But Charlton probably is a big outlier. When I was a consultant at Arsenal fans do react well to intellectualization. They do, actually. So it does slightly depend, I guess, is what I'm saying. It slightly depends on the context. And I guess what I've learned is that you do need to understand your audience. You can't just come with one thing. This is me. This is how I explain it, like it or lump it. You need to understand your audience and what information they actually want. And if the answer is they don't really want the information, then try and force it on them. It's not going to be a fruitful exercise.
I just think you and I discuss this often offline, and we have a lot of different chats. I just think there's a lot of major macro issues coming up that in our normal world of business, Charlie, we would use the phrase, let's start managing expectations. Because if it hits like a brick wall, they won't be ready for it, and it'll probably... And that's the question I have to you. How much do we need to tell people what is going to happen? You know, that if you're working in Belgian football now and all of that, you're all over the world, that, you know, you need to say to these people, I don't care how much you like your French league, how much you like your Italian league, the only way to compete with England is to get yourselves together in some kind of Super League. I don't want to talk about that, but what I'm saying is people need to start managing expectations a bit, because look what happened the last time. The fans blew their top and it was dead within 24 hours. I think that's why I think your role and what you're doing now in your podcast is so important, because it's grasping nettles that nobody wants to grasp.
It's grasping them, Roger, but it's grasping them for a relatively limited audience of people who want to see those nettles grasped. And that will always be dwarfed by the audience that doesn't. And I have to say, like, being self-critical for a moment, I have my moments of fandom with me mostly relate to English cricket. In cricket, I've never worked in cricket. I don't want to work in cricket. I am a cricket fan. I'm a fan. Okay, so when I think about cricket and feel about cricket, of course, I've got some understanding about the general context and all that type of stuff, but a lot of it has to do with my feelings. And it, to a degree at least, what will happen, and I will have very little influence over it. And I will react to it in a feeling kind of way. I was having lunch just now with a mutual friend of ours, totally by coincidence, who, as you know, has worked in the cricket world long and hard. And I've spent a lot of the last year in Jamaica, and I expressed to him my personal emotional upset about the state of West Indian cricket and what I felt the extent to which the BCCI was personally responsible for the demise of West Indian cricket, and that actually they should bear a greater responsibility as the guardians of the game for this thing. But equally, at the same time, if I was working in the BCCI or in the ICC, I would have a whole bunch of intellectualized structural talking points around the economics of the industry, around the next 5 to 10 years, and around growth markets here and growth markets there and all that type of stuff that would make Charlie Methven's emotional concerns about West Indian cricket perhaps seem a little bit like small time.
Fair enough.
And I get that.
Fair enough.
And I understand that. So like, I just find it really, really difficult sometimes. I get the sense sometimes listening to you that sometimes you do is, on the one hand, being in the industry and being alive to, alert to, and sometimes on the inside of some quite significant structural things. And on the other hand, sometimes being a fan. And having
that's the conundrum all the time, Charlie, for both of us. You know, I don't want to blow smoke up your backside, but I'll use a theological example. I think I'm John the Baptist to you, what you're doing now in that podcast, and that's been a style of saying, you know, this is the truth. This is the truth as a business person sees it. These are the macro trends that will define our industry. It is inevitable that big finance and debt and PIK financing is going to... But can I also over here say that is the worst thing possible? You know, I don't think people understand how difficult that split personality is to manage. And like I say to you, Charlie, I'm so pleased that you're now taking this on. You know, because it is such an important thing to let people understand we're not robots. It is people like us that can see both sides of it that maybe can, as I say, manage expectations.
Yeah, the management expectations is really interesting, Roger. And by the way, like you're absolutely right to say that, you know, I think we're being over modest to say that you're John the Baptist. I think, you know, let's put it a little bit more kindly and say we're treading in your footsteps. Let's see whether we're treading in your footsteps as a disciple or as
the main man.
I think probably as a disciple rather than the other way around. But somebody asked me the other day, why do you do it? Why do you do the podcast? And I said, well, the reason I agreed to do it was because, and then I thought about it. I said, because I got a bunch of stuff to get off my chest. I've got a bunch of stuff to get off my chest, which in the normal run of my executive life or consultancy life might not necessarily situationally be relevant because the stuff I'm working on is quite particular. So if I'm working in Belgian football, then the particularities of the economic structures between Indian cricket and West Indian cricket is not something that I get to talk about that often.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you sometimes come across the same thing. And also, I think perhaps sometimes one of the benefits of doing a media product, whether it be a journalism article or whether it be a podcast or whatever, is it does sometimes force you to structure your thoughts a little bit. and to go back and check in on them and to perhaps go and find a bit of supporting evidence and sometimes actually find, having spoken to a couple of people, that your original thought that you thought you had is incorrect. And that whole process is just quite a useful process.
It is.
And
it is. It is. All right, let's move on to number 3. Who's the person you wish you had never met?
So the way I chose to approach this question when you sent it across to me was, I think I said to you earlier on that people who I've found difficult or whatever it might be, I view that as part of the rich tapestry of life. And in my role as a gossip columnist in the early 2000s, I met some of the foremost scoundrels of the world. And, right from a very young age, as a boy at Oxford United with my grandfather, meeting Robert Maxwell, and onwards from there. And during my time as a journalist, I met some people who've subsequently become pariahs, who I found highly entertaining. I mean, I had lunch with Harvey Weinstein in New York and had a terrific time. And that doesn't minimize the hurt he's caused shitloads of other people. But it'd be totally intellectually dishonest of me not to memorialize the fact that I had lunch with the guy because I kept on writing articles which were negative about him. And he called me and said, why are you writing all this Bolcom stuff about me? And I said, well, if you don't agree with it, then sue me. And he goes, no. Why? Tell you what, you come to lunch with me in New York, and I'll give you so many stories about my enemies that you'll never want to write about me again.
Yeah, of course. They're not going to sue you. They're going to try and bring you to their side of the table. And that's the old game.
It's a straight trade, right?
It's a straight trade. Straight trade.
However many articles you think, however many bad stories you think about me, wait until I start giving you some about the rest of the guys.
That was Charlie, that was one of the things that truly shocked me when I went into sport. The blatant transactional nature of that. I didn't know that. And I was 34 when I went into that world, and I'd lived 5 years in the music industry, and I couldn't believe the transactional nature of what is called journalism. Drop that story, I'll give you something better. Unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, another great purveyor of that style in that period was Philip Green, who was very much that style of big shot, who would call the journalist from the back of his chauffeur-driven car and trade stories in return for keeping himself out of things and all that type of stuff. And this was kind of like normal. Maxwell did it back. Did it back in the day. I had a very funny relationship with Peter Mandelson, where I would write stuff about him and his, as I used to describe, his Brazilian dancing partner Ronaldo, his subsequent
Ronaldo El
spouse.
Fenomeno or CR7.
And he'd write me these wonderfully queeny handwritten letters. My dear Charles, I'm so disappointed. You know, this kind of stuff. So I met so many great people as well. I remember like one of the most impressive people I've met in my entire life was Sir Alex Ferguson. I remember being sat next to him at a lunch in 2003 or 4 or something like that, when he was at the peak of his powers. And he was one of the highest IQ and highest EQ people I could, even now, I would look back and say, in my pantheon of people who I was most impressed by in person over a 2-hour lunch, they would struggle to get any higher than Fergie. I mean, I just came away with the impression, whatever this guy had done, he would have been outstanding at it. He was that good. He was that smart, that well-adjusted, that cool, that he could have done whatever it is he wanted. I think of the really sort of famous ones and the villains and rogues who I met, the one who I really, really disliked was Sir Fred Goodwin.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
It was shortly after I moved from journalism into PR, and I was a partner of a PR firm, but still relatively soon out of journalism and therefore not fully trusted as a PR advisor necessarily, but with certain types of gigs where it was directly relevant, I was wheeled in as a former Fleet Street columnist. And it was 2008, and I'd been out of journalism 18 months, and Goodwin obviously was in trouble over the RBS financial blow-up, etc. And we had the contract to help train him for his sessions in front of the parliamentary committees. And I remember sitting opposite him in a meeting room and feeling this cold, hard, unpleasant aura, and every single bit of body movement, every single curl of the lip and every little sneer of the nostril, everything just spoke arrogance and coldness and unpleasantness.
Correct. I'm not going to contradict you.
I'm here to help you, mate. I'm only here to help you, and you're treating me like I'm somehow the enemy or some, but actually the truth was I was just, as far as he was concerned, I was down the food chain, not of any interest.
That's right.
He'd been made to do it by the high-ups at RBS, and he didn't really want to be there because as far as he was concerned, he'd done nothing wrong. And that was just one who I remember just looking back. I can see good in most people. And I just look back and I remember at the time thinking, I can't feel any upside in this person. This person just feels like a really horrid person.
That's a great answer. I'm going to ask another one on this because, again, we're in the confessional. Okay, it's a Catholic thing, but forgiveness, good and bad and all of that. You mentioned Alex Ferguson, right? There are many people in the sports world, whilst admiring all his talent, all his gravitas, all his IQ and EQ, will have another version of who Alex Ferguson is. Some of his ex-players, the Rock of Gibraltar, Mafia.
I broke that story.
There you go. So the point I'm making is this, and isn't this quite ironic on this chat here? In my experience, which I think is a bit similar to yours and everybody that I've met, the lovable rogue is more common than you think. The areas of grey between what I would call people of achievement and gravitas is really grey. There's not an easy bucket of good guy, bad guy. We are all saints and sinners, I would suggest, in the confessional.
I totally agree, 100%. And that's why I found this question hard, because I would look back and say, yeah, but I can't, in all honesty, say, like some sort of patsy, yeah, I had lunch with Harvey Weinstein and he was a monster. Like, for 2 hours, we actually laughed together. We took the piss out of each other, had a good time with each other. Can I see what he's done and say, whoa, that's not, I don't like that. That's, of course. But at the same time, he was a highly entertaining lunch companion who made some great films. Now, can I see with Alex Ferguson that he's somebody of exceptional ability who at the same time, in a certain moment, could make himself deeply unpleasant to somebody? Is he somebody who could be utterly ruthless and not care one bit about the outturn of the thing that he's doing? That's clearly there on his track record. Is he somebody who, in his loving of racing, gambling, and of his son's involvement in football agency, who at some points has trodden close to lines in terms of these boundaries? Sure. I guess maybe as somebody who grew up in the horse racing industry, I have a natural inclination towards people who tread that line. And I have a natural disinclination towards the Fred Goodwins of this world, who are corporate people who understand exactly where every line is. They really understand that, but are somehow lacking in humanity and lacking in what I call real, so the real stuff that really sort of makes me love somebody. And that's probably why of all the famous people I met, he was the one who turned me off the most.
Clear. That's a great answer. What train do you think you missed or were late for in life?
I keep on getting late on trains. You're early on trains. I'm late on trains. I'm a late adopter, which is pathetic, frankly. And my wife, who is an early adopter, chides me for it continuously. I'm talking about technology here. I'm often a very, very late adopter. Late to the podcast game, treading in your footsteps. I came along at the tail end of Fleet Street's glory days. I was probably lucky to get the last 5 or 6 years before the internet really started to eat the game from an advertising perspective. So at least I saw some of it. And in some ways, I was lucky that the death came quickly and I was out before I was too old. And I was able to then make a new career because some of my colleagues who were 5 or 10 years older were almost too far in by that point. They were in really senior positions and they were almost fully committed. I'm a journalist. It's what I do. I'm going to do it for the rest of my days. And it is what it is. And if the industry goes down in flames, well, I'll have to go down with it. So I don't begrudge being late on the journalism bit, because in some ways I was lucky to be a bit late on the journalism bit. I think the bit which there were two bits here. So first of all, when it came to what I did straight afterwards, I created a newspaper called The Sportsman, which is a sports betting newspaper. which is really a competitor to the Racing Post. And this was the most colossal cock-up because we spotted something which no one else had spotted, which is that you could attach online. This is 2005, so this is relatively early in the online digital
Facebook
thing.
just started,
Yeah. We recognized that you could put content online and link it to betting opportunity and take a clip of that betting opportunity. And we were the first ones to really recognize
affiliate market. That's the affiliate market.
Basically. Yeah, basically that, right? It was the very early days of affiliate marketing, but we said, okay, yeah, but if you attach content, proper content to it and around it, and you embed the betting odds in it, right? So we were on the cusp of doing something extraordinary, which was to say to the Racing Post, you can carry on producing a newspaper 7 days a week, but we're just going to gradually cannibalize that market. We're going to take it all offline, and they're going to bet through us as well, which you can't do for newsprint. So, we're going to kill you. Instead of which, like the late adopting clod that I am, is that we actually decided to also produce a daily newspaper as well. And it was the costs of producing the daily newspaper that killed it, because the online bit took off almost straight away. If you look at the business plan, I looked at it not that long ago, we were miles ahead of our KPIs on the online bit, but it was the offline bit that killed us. And that was I wouldn't say that was us being too late. It was me being basically an entrepreneur who was a late adopter. I was hanging on to something which had no need to be hung on to. Our cost base would have been exponentially lower if we hadn't been undergoing the industrial exercise of producing a newspaper. So that was a big mistake. And I think where I got a little bit unlucky is I came into PR and marketing I was late on that. I mean, not through no fault of my own, but effectively PR and marketing was lagging. The traditional PR and marketing industry was lagging the newspaper and linear TV industry by 5 to 10 years. But in the previous 20 years, people have made out like bandits, despite not necessarily even having to be that good at it. And I came along just at the end when there were a lot of competitors. There was much more downward pressure on fees, and the easy days were just starting to disappear. So I think, if there was any train that I probably feel like I could have got on board of, if I'd been a bit luckier to be around 5 or 10 years earlier, it would have been that PR and marketing train. But I guess the flip side of that, Roger, is that I sort of feel like I hit the football industry at the right time.
Yeah, oh, for sure. But listen, I thought, again, I always try and guess what the answer is going to be. It's not a stretch. It's not a stretch, Charlie, to think, because you came on our podcast a few years ago and I knew you were a natural straight away. It's not a stretch, given your gossip column background and everything like that. You could have come Piers Morgan. You could easily have been in that space.
Piers married my deputy. So it was very much that world. We were all in the same world at the same time. But I think Piers has got a degree of pushiness, which I don't have. He has a relentlessness about him. I've got a reasonably thick skin, but I am an absolute shrinking violet when it comes compared to Piers. So the ability, if you think about what he did, right, is that he left Fleet Street journalism in disgrace, and then within 3 years was presenting a mainline US CNN news program. There's no way I could pull that off. Never.
Fair enough.
And that's not I just don't have the chops to be able to do that. I mean, he's his own kind of genius. And I'm, I haven't seen him for a number of years, but I was very fond of him. Basically a good-hearted person. But what he did have was just relentless self-promotion. And, I might not be the worst at it, but I'm definitely on his league.
Let me have a bit of a parenthesis here. We're talking about Piers Morgan. You mentioned Paul Decker earlier of the Daily Mail. What is your view about the judgment on the court case of Prince Harry and all the other celebrities who thought they had the newspapers for...
I'm absolutely delighted. I've seen friends and colleagues have nervous breakdowns, die. They've been dragged through the mire. I'm quite emotional thinking about it. Absolute disgrace. There were some prima facie good cases that were brought in the early days of that whole operation that needed to be brought and were brought, and the malefactors were brought to heel. And then certain people the people around the Hacked Off campaign decided, right, now let's try and bring the whole thing down. Let's try and destroy the whole lot. And they have destroyed careers and lives of very decent people who are close to me. And I feel really quite emotional about it. I'm so delighted to see that shot down in flames. And I want to see Hugh Grant crying in his fucking porridge.
Well, I didn't know that you would be so emotional about that. So I'm glad I asked that. And I think that is
friends and former colleagues, Rog.
I get that.
I've had to pick some of them up off the floor and give them jobs because no one would employ them.
Jesus. Well, good. Okay, let's move on. We may have covered this because 4 and 5 are quite similar. What sliding door were you just in time for? You mentioned football now.
I wasn't going to say that, actually.
Okay.
I was going to say podcasting, and it was a sliding doors moment because I'll tell you what happened. And it's a whole bunch of stuff that happened in sequence, right? So it was about 3 or 4 years ago. I spoke to a friend of mine who's a big PR guy in the Middle East. And it was in between me leaving Sunderland and going to Charlton. And he said to me, look, I think there are a lot of people out there who, some are on your side, some are not on your side, etc. But I think there's a bit of an appetite potentially for things that you've got to say. I think you should start doing a podcast. And not long after that, there was a BBC journalist who I know called Adrian Goldberg, who came to me and said, look, I'm thinking of doing a football business podcast. Will you join me? And under normal circumstances, I would have said no, because I'm a late adopter. But with this advice in my mind, I said yes. And not long afterwards, I appeared on your show. And then not long after that, maybe as a result of that, I then appeared on the 20VC Business of Sports show. So I did a couple of podcast interviews. And in the case of the latter one, which was the one with the Stebbings brothers, I then didn't see them, had no reason to see them for a few months. But I was down in Cornwall, where part of my family comes from, where we have a house, a family house down there. And I was one day just walking along, and this guy goes, Charlie, anyway, it was Charlie Stebbings. And it just happened that his wife, their family also have a holiday house down in Cornwall. And we said, let's catch up for a drink. So we did on the beach at Polzeth. And we knocked the top off a couple and said how things are going. We had a chat about where we are and what we're doing and all that stuff. Nothing happened. And then 2 to 3 months later, I get a call from Charlie saying, we decided we're going to do a podcast of the kind that effectively you do, Roger, again, following in your footsteps. Would you consider being the co-host? And I had a bit of a laugh to myself because one of my favorite moments in British comedy, which is quite idiosyncratic, but I was a great fan of Alan Partridge. And there's a great episode in the first series, which is the greatest series, the TV series. The first TV series, he did a radio series beforehand, where he does a special episode called A Partridge in Paris. He does a special episode in Paris, and he gets given a French co-host, and they land up on the set in Paris. And at the start of the show, he says, and I'm very privileged to have Nina Vanier here as my co-host. And she says, well, and I too, Alan, I'm very privileged to have you as my co-host. And Partridge says, just got to pick you up on something there. I'm the host, you're the co-host. So when Charlie Stebbings said to me, you want to be the co-host, I was very clear. This is the number 2 position. But I said, okay, look, let's do a pilot episode. See if
chemistry, yeah, all of that, yeah.
Right. See if there's any chemistry. See if the whole thing works. Because I've been in media, frankly. Those guys have done an unbelievable job in venture capital.
Unbelievable Stebbings.
Unbelievable. It's a slightly untold story, bizarrely.
Well, listen, I've followed Harry since the very start, and I couldn't believe what he did in VC. I really couldn't believe it. And it is an untold story. He had to go to America to do it, which is maybe an interesting thing in itself, But yeah, so you're with the Stebbing brothers, you're with serial winners, and you've got this podcast going, and you're not sure whether it's going to work or not. What happens next?
Yeah. It worked. And in media, as you know, because you come from that music industry background, some stuff flies and some stuff doesn't fly. And you can spend a long time why this did fly or why that didn't fly. But when it flies, you back it. And when it doesn't fly, you pull it. Pretty much, give or take. And in this particular case, for whatever reason, it went well. we decided to keep on doing it. So the sliding doors moment, really, I want to track back to my great mate, Dave Kingsmore, the PR guy from the Middle East, who said to me, whatever it was now, 3-4 years ago, I think you should consider doing some podcasting, because I hadn't even thought about it up until that point. And the outcome of that, through your good offices and through the Stebbings' good offices and Adrian Goldberg and all these other people, is I've ended up becoming a podcaster. Not a full-time podcaster, just like with you. It's something that I do.
It can be full-time. I don't think it doesn't work full-time.
No, it does. It wouldn't work full-time, would it? It
doesn't work
would be crazy.
No,
I think that's right. But I really enjoy it. And I probably got to that stage in my career where enjoyment of what you're doing is really meaningful. Because you become aware, don't you, of I've only got so long left. I'm not talking like in some sort of morbid way here. There are so many useful working years I have left, and I want to do stuff that I believe in, that I enjoy. I don't want to spend the next 5 years doing something which I think is moribund or whatever it might be. So that was a real sliding doors moment. That's great, and I'm not going to go back and have the communal backslapping. We don't need that, but I think it's very interesting, Charlie, that both Charlies, the dynamic for me works an awful lot because you're in the industry. You know, we're not short of Business of Sport podcasts, but most of them are journalists or content people, and I just think you're a breath of fresh air in what you're doing, so much so that I think you do have a bit of responsibility now to decide what you want to say. You know, this isn't the podcast for us to talk about women's football or about the Super League or anything like that, but these things are all coming to a head, and you two, I think, have got the platform to make a difference. And I'm delighted. I'm delighted for you. I think the product is exactly the way it should be. And if I was one of your competitors, I don't consider myself one of your competitors. If I was one of your competitors, I'd be very worried about you guys. I'm not even sure, other than you, who the competitors are. And that's not being arrogant or something. That there are a couple of football podcasts, specific football podcasts. But with the exception of what you and your various cohorts do, Roger, and it is a very different thing, right? You've got somebody in Grant who, as you know, I adore and revere as a macroeconomist. I mean, there's a good reason why thousands of people around the world pay Grant an awful lot of money for his opinions. It's like, because the guy is just like really understands the whole big picture. And then you've got yourself with your multifaceted background, and you've got Giles, who comes from the sharp end of commercial sport to a greater degree than me, I have to say, which is, you know, really something I recognize in him. So you've got something which is quite particular, which is a sort of your own ecosystem of seniority and understanding and bringing the whole big picture together. I do see what we're doing as something a little bit more journalisty, if I may.
No, absolutely right. You do a breakdown that is in more detail.
And I think that's why, in a way, we're not competitors. And I think where we have to check ourselves and make sure we don't get too above ourselves, ahead of ourselves, is in expressing really strong opinions all the time, as opposed to explaining. And we mentioned that you've mentioned a couple of times women's football being something which I do hold strong views on. And I have to be very careful. And I think that you sort of mentioned this in terms of responsibility in trying to make sure that what I say is grounded in what I know to be the truth, as opposed to veering off into speculation, which is based on my own instincts on a constant basis. And that is something which I am quite aware of. But equally at the same time, you know, these things do have to flow a bit, don't they?
No, they do. So good luck for that, and well done on that sliding door that you got in just in time. Last question: what person do you owe most to in life, but you didn't tell them enough yet?
My maternal grandfather was the foundation of my sporting life. So my background is not very sort of starry. My father's family come from Glasgow and came down south. and have made their way originally in chocolate. And subsequently, my dad was in insurance and did fine for himself, but they're basically being Scottish people on the make. Of a kind that you'll well understand.
Oh, we took them all through the world. The whole of the world is based on Scots guys on the make.
And rather
Andrew Carnegie down.
Yeah, exactly right. And rather to that point, when I was born, my father took the whole family off to Hong Kong to make his way over there. This is 1976, so this is the year of the IMF bailout in the UK. And so we went over there when I was very young. And then when I became a little bit older, to the point where I needed to be, in a slightly more, because he was traveling all around the Far East into, what was then deepest, darkest communist China and to Vietnam and all these places. That's where he cut his teeth, really, making insurance deals in those parts of the world. So I was largely and significantly deposited back with my mother's family in Oxfordshire. And my mother's family in Oxfordshire are the opposite. So they farmed the same land in Oxfordshire for literally hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, going right the way back towards Doomsday. My mum's got 40 first cousins, and over 20 of them farm in Oxfordshire. And they're not land. They do own their own land, but they're not landowners. They've got blue diesel stained overalls and they've got straw in their hair and they farm. And my uncles still do that now. So I was deposited back on my grandfather's farm, just outside Bicester, in North Oxfordshire. And he was Farmer Brown, is his name. My mother's maiden name is Brown. And he was a wonderful gent of the old type, not because he was wealthy or privileged, but because he was a gentlemanly kind of person. But he was passionate about sport, and he'd been a very good hockey player himself. He was a good tennis player. He was involved with Headington United, which then became Oxford United. And it was on his knee that I remember my first sporting experience, which was on a hot July day like today, watching the TV in glorious Goodwood and this wonderful emerald sheen and these brightly coloured silks. And the whole thing seemed so exciting as my grandfather would be betting over the telephone with the guy at the local butcher who would take the bets. And so he got me into racing and then would take me point-to-pointing. As a farmer, he had pointers and was involved in the point-to-pointing scene. He took me to Oxford United. And at the time, Oxford were in the top division. And that was obviously part of why I guess I ended up being so heavily tethered to them, because it was a glorious time for our club. He took me to play golf. And then he would just take me up to the corn silo and just sit me on his knee and just talk to me about cricket. He'd have the Test match special going as the trailers came in and out with the wheat, and just listening to, as it would have been back in those days. And you're about 10 at this
time. You're 10, 11, 12?
7, 8, 9.
Okay, 10. So really, really formative. And
really, really formative.
I can see it. I can imagine exactly
this. Grew up in this quintessentially English situation, which was actually quite far removed from the upbringing of most of my Eton friends. It was a pretty, very middling and very earthy, sort of, quite, dirty-handed thing. We'd be out 5:30 every morning counting the cattle. And even now when I go back to see my uncle, you're herding the cattle up the hill. It's that kind of existence. And it's that background which has ended up being the most influential thing on me in my whole life, because it's taken me into sport and into loving sport and feeling it's a sort of whole part of my life. Whereas my father, who I adore, has totally different interests. He was into cars, engines, antique furniture, different types of cultures, very much Far Eastern cultures and all this type of stuff. And he and I adore each other, but we look at each other with total bemusement. We don't really have any interests in common whatsoever. He's now in his 80s, and he wanted me either to go into the army or to go into the city. Instead of which I became a horse racing journalist and a gossip columnist, and so on and so forth. And his support has been absolutely invaluable and still remains so to this very day, remains so. But if you were to ask me who's had the most influence on my life, it would be my maternal grandfather.
That is fantastic. Can I ask a couple of things about that man? Because, by the way, I don't think his influence is just that he got you into sport. I think there's a whole character thing in there as well.
Totally.
Right, so it's not just they got you into the industry. But when you listen to Test Match Special, right, you're 7, so that's about 40 years ago, 43 years ago. We were at the 1980s. That's Botham. That's Botham time.
Yeah, Botham.
Right, so what's he saying? What is this old farmer saying about guys like Ian Botham and Richards and Joe Garner and, Alan Border? What was he conveying to you about these men?
Yeah, well, my grandfather's hero was David Gower.
Lovely.
My grandfather was a very elegant sportsman. Everything he did looked elegant. And Gower, for him, embodied his style of sport. But he loved Botham as well. And I actually remember, funny enough, my father did take me to a test match. And I remember it very distinctly. It was 1985, the Ashes at the Oval. We were back in London and my parents had taken a place in Camberwell, near the Oval. And I remember us walking up to the Oval, to Kennington. I was 9 or 10, whatever. It was the last test. England were 2-1 up coming into this test. I think Gower was the captain. But I have 2 memories of the 4th and 5th day of that test, which are absolutely seminal in my mind. And I know I'm talking about cricket to a Scotsman, so I don't want to labour the point too much.
No, I was a big fan. Again, atypical Scot, big cricket fan.
Yeah. So on the 4th day, I remember David Gower stroking the ball around the park. And I remember something very particular. I remember the sound the ball made on his bat. It made a different sound to on other people's bats. It was a very distinctive clock. You could hear it, and then without any seeming effort, the thing would speed away on the ground to the boundary. And everything seemed so easy. And then on the 5th day, I remember watching, and this is sort of the tail end of Botham's glory era. I remember Ian Botham steaming in off a full run, almost from the boundary rope, with his mullet flying and his wristbands going, and him bowling this vicious bouncer that knocked Dean Jones straight off his feet. And it was the most exciting thing I'd ever seen. The roar of the Oval as an English fast bowler knocked an Aussie off his feet as we were about to win the Ashes was something that's lived with me forever. And I think, I can't remember, in an interview you've done recently, I can't remember who it was with, you asked something about, which of your heroes have you been disappointed to meet? And Botham was very much not one of those. I met Ian Botham in the director's box at Scunthorpe when I was at Oxford. And he absolutely lived up to his entire personality.
I believe that.
The whole thing, right? We ended up only getting out 10 minutes into the football match because we were all drinking too much and telling stories. Then at the end, he was also very interested in other people's stories. He was larger than life. He was full of positivity and goodwill and sort of oomph and all this type of stuff. And this was him at Scunthorpe United, the football club where he played, in his, and I just remember thinking at the time, what sort of world star like Botham would come back on a regular basis to Scunthorpe United? Bless it. He's a peculiarly English guy. He's got the faults and the strengths of a John Bull Englishman. And I wasn't at all disappointed when I met him. I thought he was terrific.
Well, more on your grandfather's side, I met David Gower. I only met him once. And David Gower and Ian Botham are 2 different types of Englishmen, right? 2 different types. And that is fascinating. So this was at the Reform Club in London, which I was a member of for many years. So you can imagine the clientele there, and David Gower was the after-dinner speaker for some kind of dinner there that I bizarrely had my son at, who was about 12 or 13 or 14 at the time. It was the first time we'd been in the Reform Club, and he was fascinated by all these old, eccentric English people that you find in the Reform Club. And I was telling him, I said, and I believe this to this day, I said, these are some of the most interesting people you will ever come across, as long as you don't expect them to be linear in their thought process. This is me, dad, telling a young boy how life is. So this was the whole thing. And then I said, the speaker is David Gower. He said he knows nothing about cricket. And I said, a little bit like you did, David Gower, who he was, elegant, batsman perhaps sometimes gets to 30, nicks one to the slips, and everybody gets disappointed. But for those 30 runs, it was the most beautiful moment. And all this. And David Gower, in the after dinner speaking, as you know what they're like with the sports people, that they talk about their lives. That's what their sporting lives. When we were in the West Indies and I took a private plane and we drove it, we landed it on the test ground. Wicked. The best after dinner speaker I've ever heard was David Gower. And that's a high bar for me. What a guy he is. What a guy. That's
fascinating. What was it that he told great stories, or was it that he was amusing?
Both. He had that. You know how everybody, Charlie, when Prince Charles was in America, and he did that speech that kind of like put down Trump and everything like that, and it was that delivery, the kind of like twinkle in the eye, and so he had the delivery, he had the timing, and he had stories about those men. The Australians, the Ashes, the West Indians, Beefy Botham. So when you've got that combination of great content with a really, really delightful delivery with great timing, it was heaven. And it just went on and on and on. And it was never boastful. It was never, when I was there, and it was always as if he was telling it, Charlie, as if he was a spectator on the life of somebody else. It was so classy,
I would love to have been David Gower.
Here's the truth coming out now, the real confessional.
I was totally hopeless about cricket.
But you are a good golfer. Grant tells me you're a very good golfer.
I'm an okay golfer, but for some reason, and it's a sort of great self-corrective, right? Because cricket is a sport which I would have dearly loved to have been good at, and I wasn't any good at it. So in a way, it sort of redoubles my fandom, because I look at these guys and I think, my goodness me, like I play golf well enough that even if I see a really good golfer, I go, well, I could hit that shot. I could do that. Whereas when I'm watching these guys play cricket, I'm like, no, I was nowhere near. No chance.
Absolutely. Listen, this has been delightful, Charlie. Everything I wanted it to be. I hope you feel the same. And all I can say is this is going to be probably the last ever confessional. I think we've had a great run. We'll see. But if it is the last one, there is no better person to finish it with. Charlie Methven, thank you very much.
If you told me this was going to be the last one, Roger, I'm not sure I'd have accepted. You should have had somebody much more distinguished than me bringing up
I think the listeners will beg to disagree on that, Charlie. You take care, my friend, and we'll see you very soon.
Thank you, Roger.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Cheers, then.